Abraham Malherbe, for whom this lecture is named, was known internationally for his knowledge of the moral philosophers in the broader context of the New Testament. He was a great supporter of this organization, the Christian Scholars Conference, and he always had a great interest in the academic exploits and development of his academic children and his grandchildren. John Fitzgerald is one of those whom he mentored, and John actually knew Abe both at Abilene and at Yale. John had transferred from Auburn, where he was a Division I football player, and he left to go to ACU, and he fell under the spell of this remarkable teacher. He then went to Yale, where Abe Malherbe had preceded him. He earned the MDiv at Yale and then studied in Germany for a year before returning to Yale and completing his PhD. As David has already mentioned, Abe was his Dr. Vater and remained a mentor throughout John's career. John spent more than 3 decades at the University of Miami, and since 2012, he has served as professor at Notre Dame, professor of New Testament. And since 2008, he's also been professor extraordinary at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. He has also been a visiting professor at both Brown and Yale. He is the appropriate speaker for this occasion. He continues the legacy of Abraham Malherbe. He has demonstrated that in 80 articles and in 10 books that he either wrote or edited. And at this time, he continues Abe's work as he is writing on in the Hermeneia series of the pastoral epistles, a work that Abe was not able to complete. He's also working on an update of Everett Ferguson's well-known book on the backgrounds of early Christianity. John is known both in this country and abroad as one of the experts on friendship in the ancient world. Also glad to have Carol with him today. And I would also mention it's a real delight to have Cornelia Malherbe here. And that was a nice surprise that she came over from Sudan. We welcome John's presentation. The title has already been given, and you can't top that title. Welcome to John Fitzgerald.
Thank you, David, and thank you, James, for that very kind introduction. It is an honor and a privilege for me to deliver the Abraham J. Malherbe Plenary Lecture here at the Thomas H. Albright Christian Scholars Conference. In recent years, I have been declining invitations to speak more and more at the exhortation of my wife, who is trying to get me to enunciate the word no much more frequently. But this was simply an invitation that I could not decline. The reason why I had to accept was Abe, who was a part of my life since 1967 until his passing in 2012. I had first heard of Abe when I arrived at Abilene Christian as a transfer student in 1967. He was already a living legend in Abilene circles in those days, but that year he was not in Abilene. He was spending the 1967-68 academic year in Cambridge, Massachusetts, doing research at Harvard and as a visiting scholar. I encountered him for the first time in the fall semester of 1968, when I enrolled in his Thessalonians course. Suffice it to say that Abe did not disappoint. He was as inspiring as he was intimidating, and he was plenty of both. To adapt the words of the Queen of Sheba to King Solomon, The report was true that I heard from the Bible bangers of Abilene regarding your learning and your wisdom. But I did not believe the reports until I registered for your class and my own eyes saw it. Not even the half had been told me. Your wisdom and exegetical insights far surpass the report that I had heard. Happy are your students. Happy are all those who read and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you in the seminar rooms and lecture halls of Abilene. As has already been indicated, Abe left, ended up at Yale, and I eventually ended up at Yale, first for the Master of Divinity degree, where I took a number of his courses, and then after a year in Germany, I returned where he became my Dr. Vater, and I became his Dr. Kent. Yeah, I'm one of Abe's kids, and I learned from him the special Malherbe way of parenting. With that tribute to my Dr. Vater, I wish to segue to my topic for this morning's lecture, to the parental task of properly rearing and educating children, which is a perennial challenge that parents all over the world face. How does one rear a good kid and avoid having a spoiled, rotten brat? My wife, Carol, and I have 2 daughters, and when they learned the title of my lecture, each daughter assumed that she was the good kid and that her sister was the brat. I hastened to tell them that both were brats, that we had failed miserably. But seriously, how does one do this? For the purposes of today's lecture, we shall travel back in time into the days of the Roman Empire. I shall begin by imagining myself as a young single man who is beginning to contemplate the possibility of marriage and children. So the first question is whether I should even get married and have kids. The topic of whether to marry was fiercely debated in the philosophical schools of antiquity, with some coming down on the side of marriage and others against it. So we're going to begin by entering that debate. On the pro-marriage side, let us hear the words of one Stoic philosopher, Antipater of Tarsus, who lived in the 2nd century BCE and was the teacher of Panaetius, the founder of Middle Stoicism. Antipater writes as follows: "The noble and courageous youth, being moreover civilized and political, perceiving that household and life can in no wise be complete except with a wife and children, holds that he must assist in increasing the fatherland. For surely the city-states would not otherwise be able to prosper unless the best children, with regard to character, marry in due season, bequeathing successors to the fatherland who will make it thrive eternally and protect its vigor to the extent that it depends upon them, never leaving it exposed to its enemies, endeavoring, both while living and having passed away, to bolster the fatherland and assist it. They consider being united in marriage among the primary and most necessary actions that are fitting, being eager to fulfill every task laid on them by nature, most especially that which furthers the proper growth of the fatherland, and even more, the honor of the gods. For if the race should die out, who will sacrifice to the gods? Some wolves or a race of bull-killing lions? Of course not. Moreover, it is the case that he who has not experienced a wedded wife and children has not tasted the truest and genuine goodwill. For the other friends or friendly affections of life are like the juxtaposed mixings of beans or other similar things. But those of a husband and wife, are like thorough blendings as water with wine. For not only do they hold in common property and children and the soul, but these alone hold their bodies in common. As we can see from this quotation, Antipater argues that marriage and children are both a patriotic and a religious duty. Beyond the civic and sacred responsibilities, however, he argues that marriage is a unique partnership and form of friendship. Following the death of the husband's parents, quote, they consent to render freely the foremost goodwill to one another, she to her husband and he to his wife, end of quote. Children are thus envisioned as growing up in a household that is characterized by the mutual goodwill of mother and father. Another voice speaking in favor of marriage and children is a Neo-Pythagorean philosopher who wrote under the pseudonym of Ocellus Lucanus, that is, Ocellus of Lucania in southern Italy. Ocellus, his brother, and two sisters were early Pythagoreans, perhaps even students of Pythagoras himself. But all of the works associated with him are pseudonymous and reflect the influence of later philosophical schools, including those of both Aristotle and Plato. The treatise that I'm going to quote from is known as On the Nature of the Universe, and is mentioned in pseudonymous correspondence between Plato and the Pythagorean philosopher Archytas. This correspondence is intended to establish Plato's dependence on Pythagorean thought. Philo of Alexandria, for example, knows this work, which probably dates from the 2nd or more likely the 1st century BCE. In it, Pseudo-Ocellus prioritizes procreation and argues as follows. We have sexual intercourse not for the sake of pleasure, but for the procreation of children. For in fact, the reproductive powers themselves and the sexual organs and the yearnings that were given to human beings by God in order to bring on sexual intercourse happen not to have been given for the sake of pleasure, but for the everlasting continuation of the race. For since it was impossible for one born mortal to share in divine life, God supplied to each of those who perish the immortality of the race, making their genesis continuous and constant. And those who have intercourse, not at all for the sake of having children, do injustice to the most revered systems of partnership. And if in fact such persons as these give birth by means of wantonness and lack of self-control, then those born will be wretched and pitiful, regarded as loathsome by the gods, by the daimons, by people, by households, and by city-states. In short, Pseudo-Ocellus is concerned not simply with reproduction, but with the procreation of legitimate children who will be good people, good citizens. He rejects promiscuous and irrational sexual copulation because he believes it will result in children who will be loathed rather than loved. In similar fashion, he argues that marriages in which wives are selected because of their family's wealth or social prominence are doomed from the outset. Such marriages, he says, will fail because of marital discord. And such discord will be ruinous not only for the household, but also for the city-state of which it is a part. Finally, Plutarch may serve as an example of the Middle Platonic endorsement of marriage and children. He was himself happily married, wrote a treatise in which he offered advice to the bride and groom, and prioritized procreation as the chief purpose of marriage. So, to summarize what we have learned thus far, if I, as a young man, living at the time of the Roman Empire, had gone to consult with Stoics, the Neo-Pythagoreans, and the Middle Platonists, I would generally have been encouraged, get married and have kids. And I would have been told that doing so was not only natural, but was also a sacred and patriotic duty. But that was only one side of the fierce debate. On the other side, we should hear the opinion that Jerome attributes, probably erroneously, to Theophrastus, the successor of Aristotle. Theophrastus certainly permits marriage as a legitimate possibility. In fact, he begins by stipulating, if the woman is beautiful, if she's well-mannered, if she is of honorable parents, if he himself is wealthy and rich, in such circumstances, occasionally a wise man would marry. In short, if you're affluent and you find the right woman, maybe, just maybe, it would be wise to marry such a good catch. But then Theophrastus quickly adds the huge caveat. All these things rarely come together in marriage. Therefore, the wise man ought not to marry. Then he proceeds to catalog the reasons against marriage and children. The first and foremost reason is that marriage poses an impediment to philosophical study. No man, he says, can be devoted to books and wife equally. That is the philosophical version of you cannot serve God and mammon. His second reason is monetary. Wives are expensive. I'm going to have to pay for this lecture because my wife is here. But I'm quoting Theophrastus. The habits of wives require many things. Expensive dresses, gold, jewels, money to spend, maidservants, various utensils, litters, and gilded chariots. His third reason is that wives, in his view, tend to be querulous and have a penchant for complaining. And now, here he comes. Further, there are garrulous complaints all night long. That lady appears in public more elegantly dressed than I do. This lady is respected by everyone, but for me, I'm despised in the presence of women. Why were you looking at that young maid next door? What were you saying to that woman? Oh, what have you brought me from the market today? Theophrastus summarizes his objections to marriage with his own litany of complaints. We can have no friend, no comrade. She suspects you love someone else, you hate her. If there's a very learned teacher in some one of the cities, we can neither leave our wives nor make the trip with such a burden. A poor wife is difficult to support. A rich one is a torment to endure. He continues for several pages, but I think you get the point. What I wish I could share with you, but have not yet found, is a list of the typical wife's complaints about her husband, which would surely have been longer and more cutting than what I have just shared. But let us not leave Theophrastus until we have heard what he says about children as a reason for marriage. I want to have kids who will take care of me when I'm old and beset by feebleness and dotage, kids to inherit my estate and to carry on the glorious name of Fitzgerald. To such concerns, Theophrastus replies, again, it is very foolish to marry for the sake of children. Either that our name may not perish, or that we may have a defense against old age and possess assured heirs. For when we depart this world, what does it matter to us if another is not called by our name? There are innumerable persons called by that same name. There are lots of Fitzgeralds in the world. Or what assistance in old age is gained by raising the son at home? Either he dies, perchance, before you, or he is often more perverse in character. And certainly, when he reaches maturity, he will think that you are slow to die. Go ahead and kick the bucket, old man. I want my inheritance. Furthermore, better and certain heirs are found in friends and relatives, whom you choose with discretion, rather than those whom you are compelled to accept, whether you want to or not. But even if the heirship is certain, it is better to take advantage of your property while you live than to leave your hard-earned gain to the uncertain use of others. How much do you leave to kids, and how much do you spend on yourself before you die? The Epicureans appear to have taken a similar position, though the issue is debated because all of the manuscripts appear to be corrupt at the crucial point. But their general belief appears to go back to Epicurus, who never married and who advised against both marriage and children. Both wife and children posed a threat to the wise man's imperturbability, to his tranquility. Although some Epicureans may have condoned casual sex without emotional attachment, Epicurus himself appears to have taken a quite negative view of sex itself. Sex, he says, is never beneficial, and you are very lucky if it does not do harm as well. Nevertheless, Epicurus did approve of marriage and child care under certain exceptional circumstances. In his will, for example, Epicurus orders his executors to care for various children until they come of age. One of those children was the daughter of Metrodorus, his friend. Epicurus said that when she came of age, she was to be given in marriage to a member of the Epicurean school, whom another founder, Hermarchus, was to select. What about the Cynics? Some Cynics, such as Crates, did marry, chiefly because he found a woman who shared his Cynic way of life. But most Cynics did not marry, with the pseudonymous letters of Diogenes, to be candid, preferring masturbation to sexual relations with women and endorsing it as the best and most effective means of satisfying sexual desires. But the Stoic philosopher Epictetus offered a loftier reason for Cynics refraining from marriage. In his depiction of the ideal Cynic, the reason for not marrying and having children was theological. Marriage would pose an obstacle to the divinely appointed mission of the true Cynic. According to Epictetus, the true Cynic must understand that Zeus has sent him to his fellow human beings as both a messenger and a scout. God has sent the Cynic to demonstrate that it is indeed possible, and I quote, "for a man who has nothing, who is naked, without home or hearth, in squalor, without a slave, without a city, without wife and children, to live serenely." It goes without saying that the true Cynic must be prepared to suffer as part of this divinely ordained manner of life, and he should never undertake his mission without God. As Epictetus puts it, ask the deity, do not attempt the task without God. For if God so advises you, be assured that he wishes you either to become great or to receive many stripes. For this too is a very pleasant strand woven into the Cynic's pattern of life. He must needs be flogged like an ass. And while he is being flogged, he must love the men who flog him, as though he were the father or brother of them all. End of quote. In short, the true Cynic is a father to all humankind. And to discharge this role, he can't take on the duties of marriage and children. But at this point in the treatise, the young man who serves as the interlocutor raises an objection. But how then will the Cynic still be able to keep society going? That is, if we all become Cynics, what will happen to society? Won't the human race just die out? To this objection, Epictetus responds, "In the name of God, sir, who do humankind the greater service? Those who bring into the world 2 or 3 ugly snouted children to take their place? are those who exercise oversight to the best of their ability over all humankind, observing what they are doing, how they are spending their lives, what they are careful about, and what they undutifully neglect. Do you not understand why a cynic will never marry or have children? Man, the cynic, has made all humankind his children. The men among them he has as sons, the women as daughters, and in that spirit he approaches them all and cares for them all. Or you do not fancy that it is in spirit of idle impertinence that he reviles those whom he meets. It is as a father he does it, as a brother, and as a servant of God. So I, as a young man, have now heard the other side, which permits marriage under various circumstances, but generally advises against it. To summarize the anti-side, there's a widespread worry about ending up in an expensive, bad marriage, marked by discord and discontent rather than concord and harmony. Furthermore, there's a general recognition that a wife and kids constitute a serious commitment of time and energy that could be devoted to other pursuits, such as the study of philosophy or the execution of a divinely appointed mission. And instead of being told that sex is pleasurable, I may even be told that it is never beneficial and can be downright harmful. Despite these warnings, however, I, like most young men, do decide to get married and to have kids. And I'm encouraged to do so by Caesar Augustus, whose marital legislation encouraged marriage and procreation, doing so by providing financial incentives to get married and to have kids, and financial penalties for remaining single even after the death of a spouse or divorce. So, I decide to get married and start a family. But it is highly unlikely that the woman I marry will be the same age as I am. The age at which men and women generally married for the first time has been the subject of debate for decades. But there is a consensus that throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, men were typically older than women at the time of first marriage. In archaic Greece, Hesiod advised men to marry at about 30 years of age, and women to marry about 5 years after puberty, which was typically viewed as being at either 13 or 14. Others gave age ranges for marriage. For example, Solon placed marriage for men in the fifth of his 10 human ages, thus between 29 and 35. And Plato viewed marriage as appropriate for men between 25 and 35 years, and for women between 16 and 20. There is also evidence for females being married at ages 12 to 14, thus shortly after puberty. Isamachus, for example, says that he married his wife when she was only 14, at a time when, as he admits, she was a mere child who had seen and heard almost nothing. As far as the evidence for Roman Italy and the western provinces is concerned, there is a well-known tension between the literary and the epigraphic evidence, with the literary sources pointing to a relatively early time of marriage among the Roman elite for both men and women, with women marrying between 12 and 15 years of age and men between 18 and 20. In keeping with this literary data, one recent study argues that Roman women commonly married around the age of 15 and men at 20, which gives a 5-year difference in the age of husband and wife. But the epigraphic evidence, which is not restricted to Roman elites, suggests a later age for the time of first marriage for non-elite men and women, with the mid-20s to 30 for the men and the late teens or possibly even the early 20s for the woman. Thus, in a typical non-elite Roman marriage, the man would have been 25 or a bit older, and the woman about 17 when they married. The epigraphic evidence from Rome is consistent with the papyrological evidence from Egypt, where the average age of marriage appears to be about 17 and a half for women and a little over 25 for men. On the whole, therefore, the evidence for Greece suggests a difference in age for married couples of some 12 to 20 years, perhaps about 15 years on average. The average age difference for Rome was less, with anywhere from 5 to 10 years being fairly common, and Jens Uwe Krause giving 7 to 8 years as the difference. The important point, whatever the precise difference in age, was that men were often anywhere between 5 to 15 years older than their wives, a difference that strongly reinforced patriarchy as the model par excellence for the organizational structure of the household. But this age differential also has an important implication, especially if my bride is significantly younger than I am. Not 5, but 15 years younger. All things considered, I am much more likely to die before she does. For my wife, it means that she will enter into the marriage realizing that there is a statistical probability that she will be left a widow and our children will be left orphans. That is, as children without a father. In his massive 4-volume study of widows and orphans in the Roman world, Krause estimates that during the time of the Roman Empire, some 40 to 45% of children aged 14 to 15 had lost their father. So think about it. Typical 15-year-old kid, nearly half of the cases, the dad will be dead. Given the low life expectancy in antiquity, this means that I would be unlikely to still be alive when my eldest son married. According to the estimate of Mark Golden, only 1 or 2 of every 10 men reaching the age of marriage would still have a father alive to witness the wedding. The odds of me becoming a grandfather through my son would be statistically even less. But there are 2 other mortality risks that we should note in this connection. First, in contrast to the modern world, the death of a woman during childbirth was much more common. Reliable statistics are difficult to come by, with estimates ranging anywhere from 2.5% to 33%. Whatever the actual statistics, the danger was real. One of the most famous women to die during childbirth was Julia, the only child of Julius Caesar. Julius had given her in marriage to Pompey as part of the negotiations that led to the formation of the first triumvirate in Roman history. But she died along with her child in childbirth, and her death was one of the factors that led to the dissolution of that first triumvirate. One of Pliny the Younger's friends, Helvidius, had 2 daughters and lost them both in childbirth. As these examples show, a woman who gave birth knew that she not only would experience great pain, but also put her own life at risk. Yes, the surgical procedure known as cesarean section did exist, but it was normally performed when the mother was already dead or was dying. That is, C-sections were rarely, if ever, attempted to save the life of the mother. It was almost always an attempt to rescue the fetus when the mother was already dead or past any realistic hope of surviving. It was performed without anesthesia and without antibiotics. So if performed while the woman was dying, the pain would have been excruciating. She was being sacrificed in an attempt to save the child. It is occasionally claimed that the great exception to this was Julius Caesar, whose mother Aurelia died about a decade before he was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. This claim is based on the fact that Pliny the Elder says that the first of the Caesars got that name from the surgical operation performed on his mother. That is, because the child was cut from the womb, kaiso, he became known by the cognomen Caesar, or Caesar, which was then passed on to his descendants. Unfortunately, the great problem here is that Pliny gives this as an example of mothers who died while giving birth, and there is no ancient evidence that I know of that refers to any mother surviving a C-section. Second, the danger of infant mortality was even greater than that of maternal mortality. Aristotle famously said that most children die before the 7th day. Most children don't make it past the first week, which is a statement as alarming as it is appalling. Keith Hopkins speculates that 28% of Roman children died within their first year, and Peter Garnsey estimates that approximately 50% of children died before they reached the age of 10. In short, the decision to get married and have kids is risky. So it is not to be undertaken without much forethought. But even though my young wife and I know the dangers of childbirth, we both decide to run the risk. She becomes pregnant, and our first act in an attempt to provide a welcome for our newborn child is by securing the services of a good midwife, who was most likely would have been a freedwoman, that is, an ex-slave who had been manumitted. In the early 2nd century of the Common Era, a physician by the name of Soranus wrote a highly influential work on gynecology that covered conception, pica, or the period of constant craving for something to eat, and delivery. The practices he advocated did much to improve obstetric care and improve the outcomes for both mother and child. And his work was written especially with midwives in mind. He begins by noting the qualities that one wants in a good midwife. He says that the best midwife is someone who is knowledgeable about theory in addition to handling actual cases, and is able to prescribe hygienic rules, to observe both general and individual symptoms, and to discover what needs to be done. She'll be calm and unruffled in crises, and be able to give a clear account of the procedures she is using. She will provide reassurance to her patients and will be sympathetic. She'll be prudent and always sober, since she is never sure when she will be summoned to a woman in danger. She will be discreet, since she knows that she will share in the secrets of private life. The midwife's services will begin already during the post-conception phase of pregnancy, where she will typically prescribe bed rest as well as a bland diet, perhaps of eggs or rice porridge, to combat the nausea and the cravings for various food. She might also give my wife a massage with olive oil, or recommend that I or one of my slave girls does so. Our child will, of course, have been born in our home, for hospitals did not yet exist in the early days of the Roman Empire, and the baby would have been cleaned and swaddled by the midwife. Following the advice of Soranus, our newborn child will be breastfed for the first 3 weeks by a wet nurse, and then by my wife herself. The selection of the nurse or nanny will be the second most important decision that my wife and I make for our child. A special bond will quite likely develop between our child and its nurse, and we will not view this as diminishing the unique bond between mother and child. We will regard it rather as widening the network of physical and emotional support for our child, and given the high mortality rates of our world, we will regard a wide network of support as a very good thing. But this means that we must not choose just any woman for this role, but give particular attention to her moral character, and her manner of speech. We will follow the advice of Quintilian, who recommended, and I quote, "Above all, make sure that the infant's nurse speaks correctly. Of course, she should without doubt be chosen on the basis of good moral character, but still make sure that she speaks correctly as well. The child will hear its nurse first and will learn to speak by imitating her words." End of quote. Our third major decision will concern the male slave whom we will choose to be our child's guardian and companion. The Greeks called him a pedagogos, that is, a pedagogue, and he was present from an early age. In the preschool years, he rocked the baby's cradle, he played with the kids, he took them on outings, he taught them table manners, and generally babysat them. In many cases, he gave young children their first lessons in reading and writing, functioning as a kind of pre-kindergarten teacher. Once our kids were old enough to start formal education, he was the one who escorted them to and from the school teacher, as well as to and from the baths, the theater, and various social functions. Given the fact that the pedagogos was going to be the child's constant companion for so much of the day, you needed someone really good who would keep your kids out of trouble and make sure that they behave properly. The rhetorician Libanius puts it this way: "For let us consider why it is that parents hire those who are to supervise their sons. Is it out of a desire to spend money in vain? To squander their wealth? How can that be? No one is so stupid. But what is the goal toward which they are looking? They know that the young have a natural proclivity toward mistakes, that they always hold an opinion opposite to what is best, and that they shun those activities from which they might obtain happiness, while pursuing those through which they might become utterly miserable. And so, in order for the young man to be able to learn from his elders what he must devote himself to and what he must abstain from, for this reason, parents give the most forethought here to seeking out the very best possible pedagogues, regarding that man's judgment as the yardstick of their son's actions. And there is proof of this, for every man judges the character of a youth by the character of his pedagogue. And if the latter is a good man, he also expects better results from the former. But if the latter is not such a man, he develops worse hopes about the youth as well. Therefore, it is the father's job to provide the money, but it is the job of the pedagogue to take thought for everything else without holding back. It is for this reason that beating and choking and torturing and everything done by masters toward their slaves, they think that these two should be permitted to those who supervise their sons, so that there may be no excuse afterwards. One should recall here that Paul had very negative things to say about the pedagogue. It's easy to see why. As this passage from Libanius suggests, we will insist on our children behaving properly, and we will not hesitate when necessary to embrace harsh discipline as a means of achieving this goal. In the ancient world, that would usually have included corporal punishment. That method was ubiquitous in the ancient Mediterranean world, where it was used both at home and in school, and was employed by pagans, Jews, and Christians alike. It was understood as tough love, but as love nevertheless, and it flourished because it reflected a belief that was later encapsulated in an old English proverb: spare the rod, spoil the child. As modern parents, my wife Carol and I did not adopt that method of child rearing with our own children. And it is important to note that there were both pagans and Christians who dissented from this standard practice. One pagan who advised against it was Pseudo-Plutarch, who in his treatise on the education of children says, and I quote, "This also I assert, that children ought to be led to honorable practices by means of encouragement and reasoning, and most certainly not by blows or ill treatment. For it surely is agreed that these are fitting rather for slaves than for the freeborn. For so they grow numb and shudder at their task, partly from the pain of the blows, partly from the degradation. Praise and reproof are more helpful for the freeborn than any sort of ill usage, since the praise incites them toward what is honorable, and reproof keeps them from what is disgraceful." Among the Christians, John Chrysostom comes out firmly against the use of corporal punishment. "Make it a law straightway," he says, "that the child use no one in despite, that he speak ill of no man, that he swear not, that he not be contentious. If you should see him transgressing this law, punish him, now with a stern look, now with incisive words, now with reproachful words. At other times win him with gentleness and promises. Have not recourse to blows constantly, and accustom him not to be trained by the rod. For if he feel it constantly, as he is being trained, he will learn to despise it. And when he has learned to despise it, he has reduced your system of child rearing to naught. Let him rather at all times fear blows, but not receive them. Threaten him with a thong, but do not lay it on, and do not let your threats proceed to action. Do not let it appear that your words do not pass the stage of threats, for threat is only of use when intended by the belief that it will be put into effect. If the offender learn your intention, he will despise it. So let him expect chastisement, but not receive it, so that his fear may not be quenched, but may endure. Yet when you see that he has profited by fear, forbear, hold off, seeing that our human nature has need of some forbearance too." End of quote. In short, Chrysostom prefers non-corporal measures. The stern look, my mom's own favorite method. The cutting remark, my dad's. The stronger word of reproach, the principal at my school. Or alternatively, the use of gentle words and promises. Whipping a child, in his view, has diminishing returns. If used too much, it will create spite. It's okay to threaten him with the warning that he's going to get a thrashing. But if he persists in his unacceptable behavior, so that he is afraid that he will be whipped if he persists. If the threat is real, his fear will be real, and he will desist. And in that case, forbear, and do not actually whip him. I should add the comment that in my own house in life, I was accustomed to my dad's whip, but that was nothing. At school, at my time, corporal punishment was allowed. I don't remember what I did when I was, I think, a junior or senior in high school, but I was sent to the vice principal's office where I was told to drop my drawers, put my hands against the wall, and then assaulted with a baseball bat. Quite literally. So perhaps my perspective comes somewhat from that. I would hope, however, that my wife and I would have adopted an approach that sought a middle course between severity and indulgence, an approach that embraced both praise and rebuke, that used rewards as well as punishments. This was the method, in fact, that Seneca the Younger recommended. It is of the utmost importance, says Seneca, that children be raised in the correct manner, even if this means harsh discipline from the beginning. We must be careful not to allow them to have fits of anger, but we must also be careful not to stifle their individual personalities. Unlimited freedom creates an intractable personality. Total repression produces an abject one. Praise lifts the spirit and makes a child self-confident, but too much praise makes him insolent and bad-tempered. We must therefore steer a middle course when rearing a child, sometimes holding him back, sometimes spurring him on. He should be subjected to nothing that is humiliating, nothing that is servile. Don't let him whine and pester you for treats. Give rewards only for good deeds or promised good behavior. When he is thrust into competition with children of his own age, don't let him sulk or become angry. When he wins or does something laudable, he should be praised, but not allowed to become excessively elated. For joy leads to exultation, and exultation leads to a swollen head and an inflated opinion of oneself. We should allow him a certain amount of leisure, but never let this develop into idleness. Never let the child become accustomed to a soft and easy life. The more a child is indulged, the more liberty he is allowed, the more will his disposition be spoiled. For the child who has been denied nothing, whose tears an anxious mother always dried, who always had his own way with the pedagogue, this child will be unable to cope with the harsh realities of life. End of quote. In seeking for guidance on rearing children, I turn to, especially boys, I turn to a treatise written by Cito Bryson, a Neo-Pythagorean author who wrote a work on household management. In this four-part work, he discusses the acquisition, use, and preservation of property in part 1, the wife in part 2, slaves in part 3, and children in part 4, where he focuses on the male child. This fourth part is remarkable, for it contains the longest and most detailed discussion of children that I know of in any ancient work on household management. In what follows, I shall mention only the high points. Cito Bryson begins by mentioning the importance of beginning the training and education of children when they are small. He recognizes that habits are formed at an early age, so he wants to ensure that good habits and practices begin early, that they are ingrained and become part of the children's moral character. In a similar way, he wants bad habits to be avoided because he recognizes that bad habits are extremely difficult to break. And so he says, and I quote, "His education must begin when he is small, for the small child is readier to obey and quicker at cooperating when he is small. He is not yet ruled by habit, which prevents him from pursuing what one wants of him, and he lacks the determination that drives from orders. When he has become accustomed from his youth to fine practices and praiseworthy deeds, he stays with them and supplements them as he comes to understand them. But if he is neglected and let go until he becomes accustomed to the dominant characteristics to which his nature inclines him, or has become accustomed to base things that are not in his nature, and he is then taken to be educated once these things have achieved dominance over him, it will be difficult for whoever is teaching him to turn him aside, and he will not easily be separated from what is now normal for him." End of quote. The task of properly rearing a child thus begins, according to Bryson, at home. When children are small, before you send them off to school, if we wait for the teacher at school to teach them right from wrong, what to do and what not to do, we have waited too long and made the teacher's task all but impossible. So training, or what we today tend to call nurture, is highly important for Cito Bryson. But for him, so is nature. For him, it is not a question of nature versus nurture, but of nature and nurture. Nature is important for him, and so he says, and I quote, "The best sort of boy is the one who is endowed by nature with shame and love of honor and takes pride in it. If he is like this, it is easy to educate him. But in the case of a boy who has little shame, who despises honors, and who is far from proud, educating him is difficult. And with this type, there is no alternative but to employ fear and terror when he does wrong, than to accomplish one's aim with blows if using fear does not work. And finally, to treat him well if he behaves well. In the case of the boy with pride, who has a love of honor, praise and blame following good or wrong behavior, achieve what punishment and gifts cannot achieve in the other boy. In short, not all children are the same. And what works with one child may not work with the other. Consequently, parents will need to adjust their parenting techniques and practices to the child's nature and how he or she responds to their directives. At this point in his treatise, Pseudo-Bryson turns to particular aspects of life for which the boy will need to be trained. He lists eating, drinking, sleeping, posture while standing, posture while sitting, movement, speech, and other things such as clothing. Many of the things that Pseudo-Bryson says were repeated by my own parents some 2,000 years later. Don't gobble down your food. Don't take such big bites. Don't speak to one's elders until spoken to, and so forth. But what is unusual and highly distinctive about this particular text is that he treats sexual education. And here is what he says. A warning must be given to the boy about sexual intercourse or obtaining knowledge of any aspect of sexual intercourse or coming near it before he is married. This ensures closeness to God, good repute among men, bodily health, proper growth, maintenance of purity and cleanliness, and self-control. Furthermore, if the man does not know a woman apart from his woman, and the woman does not know a man apart from her man, the love of each one of them for the other partner is the greatest love there is. His heart enfolds her, and her heart enfolds him. This is among the most beneficial of things for the man and the woman jointly. In short, Pseudo-Bryson here comes out against both premarital and extramarital sex. And he argues that the mutual fidelity of husband and wife will result in them having the greatest love for each other and for deriving the maximum benefit from their marriage. Finally, since my wife and I are Christians, we will give particular heed to the task of rearing our children in the Christian faith. This concern appears already in the New Testament, in Colossians and Ephesians. In these two books, children are instructed to obey their parents, and fathers are warned about being too severe with their children, provoking them or creating anger and resentment. In short, the worry here is not with dads being too lax and spoiling their children, but with them being too harsh. This was in fact a common concern. In one of his letters to a friend, Pliny the Younger tells of a time when he reproached a father for the harsh way in which he had rebuked his son. He said to this man, "Hey, have you never done anything that your father could criticize?" Did I say, have you done? Do you not now sometimes do things which your son, if he suddenly became your father, could criticize with equal severity? Pliny then goes on to say to his friend, and I quote, "I was reminded by this example of excessive severity to write to you, as one friend to another, lest you on some occasion treat your son too harshly and strictly. Remember that he's a boy, and that you were once a boy, and perform your duty as a father, always remembering that you are a human being and the father of a human being." But of all the Christians in the early church who gave attention to child rearing, it is John Chrysostom who shines out. One of his treatises is an address on vainglory and the right way for parents to bring up their children. In this homily, he gives attention to a wide variety of things that Christian parents are concerned with. For example, he encourages parents to name their children after righteous people, not after relatives. Maybe he knew my family. In contrast to Colossians and Ephesians, which addresses only fathers, Chrysostom also addresses mothers and gives counsel to them. He wants both father and mother, for example, to give attention to what they give kids. He's worried with parents being overly concerned with giving children physical things and not being sufficiently concerned with their spiritual upbringing. That spiritual guidance includes instructions not to abuse domestic servants, to be patient when they suffer wrong, but to be quick to run to someone's defense when he observes something being done that is unjust. And above all else, he wants Christian families to have a time when children are taught stories from the Bible, using the biblical stories to teach lessons about life and about faith. Then take the kids to church and pay particular attention when the story you taught them at home is the subject of the preacher's sermon. He says, "You will see your child rejoice and leap with pleasure because he knows what the other children do not, and he anticipates the biblical story. He recognizes it, derives great pleasure from it and great gain. And henceforth, the episode is fixed in his memory." And finally, when we do take our children to church, as we definitely should do, we will rejoice that the children also participate in the liturgy. They will learn, among other things, to pray, "Lord, have mercy." Book 8 of the Apostolic Constitutions, which comes from the late 4th century but draws on earlier sources, gives emphasis to the prayers of children because their prayers were seen as being especially efficacious. In closing, I trust that these words from the ancient past will prompt reflection in the present. Let us rear our children well and remember, as my younger daughter said in response to one of our parental admonitions, they will be choosing the nursing home where we spend the rest of our days. Thank you.